that all right? So, as Henry IV would say in the Battle of Agincourt, we happy few, we band of brothers. And here we are. Thank you for coming. Okay, tonight we are so fortunate to have Bill Miller speak on his book, Steel City. Steel City is the story of Pittsburgh in the 1890s, the golden age when its wealth and innovations were like our present day Silicon Valley. It was the time of Carnegie, Frick, Heinz, and Westinghouse, names familiar to us. And Pittsburgh was a very, very important city in the United States. The author does a great job of showing the dichotomy between the ultra-rich families and the poor working class, a situation we have today. Bill can write about Pittsburgh, having grown up there, and having spent his career in journalism as a reporter, a publisher, a blogger, and Time Inc. consumer marketing veteran. Bill told me when we met earlier this week that he had worked at the Westerly Sun as a teenager and also at the New London Day for a summer or two when he was at Trinity in Hartford. He now lives with his wife, Warren, in Watch Hill, and is on the board of both the Watch Hill Conservancy and the Westerly Library. He's going to speak, and following his talk, he'll take your questions. There will be books for sale in the vestibule after the talk. But before we begin, please turn off your cell phones. Now, let's give Bill a very warm welcome. You're on. Here's water for you if you need it. Oh, yeah, you take this too. Thanks.
Oh. Okay. Great. Does this need to be on? Oh. How's that? Everybody can hear now. Great. Well, Susan, thank you so much for the invitation. As you alluded to, I grew up in Pittsburgh, but I've spent every summer of my life in Watch Hill. We used to hop in the car the day after school was out, drive the 10, 12 hours, whatever it was, get to Watch Hill, go down the hill and have dinner at the Greeks, and the summer began. I'm 40 years in New York City. My wife Warren and I live there in a variety of places, but now we're Westerly residents, and but are also living part of the year in Greensboro, North Carolina. As was discussed, I went to Hotchkiss and Trinity, both Connecticut schools. I actually worked at the day after college. That's okay. For a couple of years. I then owned a paper called the Seaside Topics that some of you old timers might remember. That was basically kind of a little bit like the Shiny Sheet in Palm Beach. It talked about who was speaking at the chapel and who was visiting who that weekend. And after my career basically selling subscriptions and newsstand sales at Time Inc., at the end of that, I began a blog. My wife and I spent a lot of time going to the theater, movies, opera, ballet, etc. in New York. And so I decided, well, why don't I write about some of these things? So I started a blog of reviews called Who's Your Favorite Beatle? And the name comes from the fact that that's when we were kids, that's our main cultural conversation was who's your favorite Beatle? But I'd always kept my hand in writing and publishing throughout my career. And it's an honor to be here in Stonington today with its rich history and its literary traditions. So just to take a step back, why did I write a book and why did I write this particular book? Well, I think I've always wanted to be a writer ever since I read Hemingway and Fitzgerald and their biographies at Hotchkiss. And for writers, the ultimate goal is a book. And I've achieved that with my first historical fiction, Steel City, and I've loved every step of the way. The research, the writing, the editing, the promoting. The one part I didn't like so much is trying to find a publisher, but I got one. I was very lucky. I found one. And, as I was thinking about writing, I had thought, well, I don't want to write, as interested as I am in history, I didn't want to write nonfiction. It just doesn't give you the freedom, and I didn't want to submit to the academic rigor of nonfiction. My friend Harry here is very expert at that, and I admire you for that. But I wanted the freedom of fiction and to stay within the factual boundaries of historic events. So now, why this book? As I said, growing up in Pittsburgh, and in Pittsburgh, history is all around you all the time. I grew up on the same street as Henry Frick's mansion, Clayton, where his daughter, Helen Frick, still lived. I always have to say I lived in very different circumstances than Henry Frick did. My childhood memories center around the Carnegie Library and Museum in Pittsburgh, which is a wonderful complex, still very vital today. I had family connections to that history too. My great-grandfather is a man named Willis McCook, and he was a lawyer for Henry Frick. On the other side was a man named Dr. William Holland, and he was the first person appointed by Carnegie to run the museum and library. There's something about Pittsburgh that just stays in your soul. Many people there that I grew up with there are still my friends now. We get together every year to go to a Steelers game. You can't underestimate the importance of what sports and professional sports are to the city of Pittsburgh. It's provided so much identity to it through very hard times. And I have very fond memories of the Steelers, the Immaculate Reception, and if you don't know what that is, I'll tell you about it later. The 6 Super Bowl rings, which is as many as the Patriots, and I think twice as many as all the New York teams combined. And the Pirates' 1960 Mazeroski's home run, and of course the sublime Roberto Clemente. But these are all great memories and of that city. But one of the things I was particularly fascinated with was the rise and the flourishing of the steel industry. So you might be thinking that you're not from Pittsburgh, and why should you read this book? Well, Pittsburgh was so important in the late 19th century, and it was the leader in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the steel industry provided the same kind of innovation that Silicon Valley does today. It really was the center of the industrial world and the center of industry in this country. Plus, there were great historical characters. Andrew Carnegie had been a bobbin boy in Scotland, came over to this country. One of his first jobs was running telegrams around downtown Pittsburgh, working for the Western Division of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He soon ingratiated himself to a man named Tom Scott, who ran that division, became his telegraph operator because he had the fastest finger in town. And that's really the kernel of the Carnegie fortune, because he would get stock tips or overhear things as he read the telegrams. And he invested some of that money, and as we say, the rest is history. Then there's Henry Frick, known as a very hard, difficult man, anti-labor, and he grew up in a place called Connellsville that is in the middle of the coal center of Western Pennsylvania. His family had run a whiskey business, and the name is Old Overholt. And believe it or not, couple of years ago, I took my daughter and son-in-law to Pittsburgh, and I asked Graham, said, order an old Overholt and see what they do. Damned if they didn't have it right there. It's a rye whiskey, which I don't think a lot of people drink rye anymore, but I certainly don't. But one of the most important aspects of his early life was becoming friends with Andrew Mellon. That then connected him with the T. Mellon and Sons Bank, which lent him the money so he could mine the coal fields and then create coke, which is burned in these beehive ovens. And the coke is then used. It's a vital part of the Bessemer process that allowed steel to be made quickly and cheaply. Then there are two men who I don't know why, I've always associated with them Pittsburgh, but I didn't really associate them with that era. H.J. Heinz. He is really the beginning of the food. He began the food processing industry. He had, and I think some argue rightfully that he had the first assembly line. Henry Ford would probably beg to differ, but if you can picture this, I mean, the first product wasn't ketchup, it was pickles. And their tagline was 57 varieties. I'm not sure that anybody could name those 57 varieties, but you can imagine an assembly line and all these women working at the assembly line. And he was one of the few people who employed women at the time. And you think of the pickles, the jars coming along and the ladies putting the pickles in the jar. And you might remember the old Lucy, I Love Lucy show with Lucy and Ethel trying to put the chocolates into the boxes and then eating them at the same time. And then there was George Westinghouse, which I find to be one of the most fascinating characters of all of these people. He was an incredible inventor. He invented the air brake for railroads, which basically revolutionized train travel because it allowed these, they've done a very good job of creating these huge monster of trains and getting them rolling, but they didn't have such a good way of stopping them. And so the air brake allowed him to do that and created his first fortune. He later went on to champion the AC, alternating current mode of electricity delivery. He was in direct competition with Thomas Edison, who had the DC version. Westinghouse eventually prevailed. There's some great books about that rivalry, and Tesla is a big part of that. As he worked for both sides, there's a book called The Current Wars, which I highly recommend. But beyond the history, I did have these main events. The first was the Johnstown flood. Second was the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. And then there was the Morgan buyout. And those are things that I'd read fairly extensively about. And there's some terrific books about all of those subjects, particularly David McCullough's book on the Johnstown flood, which is his first book. He wrote it in 1968. And it's like all of his books, it's just a marvel. And he was really an inspiration for me to write my book. So I spent a year researching that. Warren and I took several trips out to Pittsburgh to visit things like where the flood happened in Johnstown, visited something called the Cary Iron Furnace, which was one of the original blast furnaces, and they told me it was going to be a 2.5-hour tour. And I said, what could you possibly show us? I mean, this is an old abandoned iron furnace, not a working iron furnace. But we didn't want to leave after 2.5 hours. It was so fascinating. But so the history part I was very comfortable with, but not so much because I'd never written fiction before. Weave fictional characters into this history. So that's where I came up with Jamie Dalton. He's the protagonist of the book. He's from a well-off family. His father is an attorney. In fact, Henry Frick's attorney. That's the only that's the only real connection to a real person. As I mentioned, my grandfather, great grandfather, working for Frick, but there's no other connection. The rest, anything else about him is fiction. Jamie, I opened the book with a very short teaser about the flood, and then in the next chapters, I talk about his somewhat troubled youth in Pittsburgh, you know, ups and downs he had there, and then at Yale. I wanted to get a flavor for what that late 19th century is like before really diving into what was going on in Pittsburgh. Jamie has a football injury. He can't play sports anymore, and he begins to work at the Yale Daily News. And in the same time, the faculty advisor for the news gets him an internship with a paper in Pittsburgh. And so his father, a lawyer working for the steel company, did not like the fact that Jamie was going to be a newspaper man. He thought it was a dead-end profession, couldn't understand why anybody wouldn't want to take the opportunity of being a lawyer or working in the steel industry. I had somewhat the same conversation with my father when I decided to work at the New London Day. He wasn't a lawyer and he wasn't in the steel business, but he still didn't see why I wanted to do that. Jamie is battling with his father about becoming a newspaper man as a permanent career, and he goes up to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, which his parents were members of. It was a club founded on Little Connemara Lake up in above Johnstown and South Fork, 14 miles above Johnstown, and to kind of think about what he's going to do and whether he really does want to be a newspaper man. And that's the fateful weekend of Memorial Day, 1989. And he is out riding in the morning and he actually sees the dam collapse. It was a lake that had been created originally to fuel the Pennsylvania Canal. You probably haven't heard of the Pennsylvania Canal. Well, it never really went anywhere because they built the Pennsylvania Railroad and they didn't need a Pennsylvania Canal. And he sees this dam collapsing and he immediately says, I know what I want to do. I'm going to report on this flood and that will be my career. I'm going to read a section about the flood in just a second, but just to give you an idea of the enormity of it, it traveled 14 miles down this valley. It leveled 6 towns along the way, and then all of downtown. I almost said downtown. That's how you pronounce it in Pittsburgh. It leveled all except 2 buildings in downtown Johnstown. 2,000 people were killed, and that was the largest natural disaster in the history of the country up until the Galveston flood in 1900, and it still is the second largest. I mean, just to give you some perspective on that, we've all been hearing about the horrible wildfires in Maui. Right now, there are about 100 people who were killed in that. This is 20 times that. The area of destruction, back of the envelope calculation, is 3 times as large in Johnstown as it was in Maui. I mean, I always think, what would it be like if the Johnstown flood was covered by the media today, and how long it would be in the main topic of the news? I think it would overwhelm anything we've ever seen before. That's not to say there wasn't newspaper coverage back then, but not quite as immediate as seeing the destruction on TV. Let me just give you a quick reading here to give you an idea of what was happening during that. The flood gained speed as it funneled down the valley. I would be behind the crest of the wave. He's on horseback, but I needed to observe as much as I could and get to a telegraph and wire Cleveland Brooks. I stopped at South Fork and was told that the telegraph was out from Mineral Point to Johnstown. I hurried ahead, knowing that I would not be in touch with Mr. Brooks anytime soon. Despite all the devastation I was seeing, it thrilled me to have the chance to prove myself. Just below South Fork, there was a stone viaduct that had stopped the waters and a lake formed behind it. That momentary pause allowed me to catch up with the surge. The clod of uprooted trees and mud had overwhelmed the bridge, and it was as though there was a second dam collapse. I stared in amazement as pieces of houses, even the stone from the viaduct, hurtled along. It looked like some kind of liquid battering ram. The waters were flowing even faster, and I had to urge my horse to a gallop to keep up. The flood looked like a giant wave hitting the shore, crumbling everything in its path. The next town down the valley was Mineral Point. The townspeople had received telegraph warnings, and hundreds of them were perched on the hillside above the river. They watched helplessly as the roiling waters obliterated their village. All the houses, even the town's sawmill, had been sheared away, leaving only soil and rock. The clapboard, the shingles, and the contents of the houses were now part of the rampage. I spurred my horse along the ridge to East Conemaugh, and over the roar of the river, I heard the plaintive, steady wail of a railroad whistle warning people to escape. I arrived just in time to see a 30-foot wave of garbage level the town. Residents were scrambling up the steep side of the valley. Passenger and freight trains were stopped on sidings because of track washouts, and the conductors and engineers were urging passengers to leave the car and get to safety. When the 3-story wave hit the town, I saw passengers that hadn't made it to the hillside disappear under the water. As the flood swept over the railroad yards, the freight and passenger cars were tossed about as if they were a child's train set. The water smashed the roundhouse and swept 50-ton locomotives downstream. Now the waters were filled with scores of railroad cars and houses. Nothing could stand up to the force of the water and the lethal objects it carried. Even worse, I saw a sign saying Conemaugh wire bobbing in the water, and I knew what danger that portended. The barbed wire that mill produced would entangle every bit of scrap along the way to Johnstown. Below East Conemaugh was Woodvale, a village that bordered Johnstown in its eastern end. Larger than Mineral Point, it had been built as a model town by the Cabri Iron Company. Neat white Cape Cod-style homes lined its symmetrical street. There had been no morning blast to rouse the resident. As my horse and I, both panting from our race down the valley, watched, the town was reduced to rubble in less than 5 minutes. Houses, a sawmill, and a streetcar shed all gone. Townspeople tried to outrun the wave of water, then one by one, they all disappeared in the boiling froth. There were horses from the streetcar shed craning their necks for air before slipping beneath the surface. Across the valley, I could see a sign that said Gautier Ironworks. Steam from the water hitting the boilers plumed into the sky. More dangerous than the speed and the lethal height of the wave was what it contained. Telegraph poles, railroad cars, horses, human bodies, and miles of barbed wire certain to catch up anything in its path. I shivered in fright and raised my eyes to heaven. I had never been one for prayer, but I beseeched God to spare all innocent people in the flood's path. So, I hope you have from that a vivid picture of what people were faced with that day and for days to come. Jamie did get a scoop on other reporters because nobody was there until the flood was telegraphed. The signs of the flood were telegraphed to other people, so that got him solidified his job. It was important for him to be, for my protagonist to be a newsman, because it allowed him logically to see all these great events of that time. After the flood, there was the tremendous violent strike at the Homestead Steel plant. That plant isn't there today, but it covered 3 miles of shoreline along the Monongahela River. And Henry Frick, there was Henry Frick, it was actually a lockout, not a strike. And Henry Frick wanted to get his Pinkertons in to make sure that the scabs, or black sheep as they called them in that day, were able to get into the plant. The Pinkertons came in 2 barges up from the Ohio up the Monongahela and met the townspeople on the shore of the river. And a gun battle ensued. The terrible violence that day was something that basically ended the Union movement in Pittsburgh for 40 years. The Pinkertons surrendered. They were taken up the street in what became known as the Gauntlet to the town square to get them to railroad cars. Everyone in the town was along the Gauntlet, and women, children, and men assaulting the Pinkertons with everything from pots and pans to knives and forks and anything they could get their hands on. And that basically turned public opinion against the strikers. That was in March. By October, they'd all returned to New York to work. They'd had to sign what's called yellow dog contracts, saying that they wouldn't join a union. And that was really it for unions in the steel industry until the Depression. Surprisingly, 2 weeks later, Henry Frick was in his office. A man who had been there earlier that day, saying he was a job seeker, came back after lunch. He shot Frick twice. He stabbed him 3 times. And it would seem too much a coincidence if it didn't have some truth in it. But Frick was in a building where there was a newspaper. And so I have Jamie getting in the middle of that because he hears the gun go off and helps wrestle the assailant away from Frick. Fascinating details about that. Frick refused to have any anesthesia because he said, well, how are you going to know where the bullets are in my neck unless I tell you? So he didn't have the anesthesia. They got the bullets out. They sewed up the knife wounds. And then the doctor said, well, now, Mr. Frick, we must get you in the ambulance and take you to the hospital. And he said, I've got papers to sign. And so he wouldn't leave until he finished his work. And finally, they took him to a hospital and then eventually out to his home in Homewood. Towards the end of the decade, I think what I found fascinating was the tremendous fights between Carnegie and Frick over the disposition of the Carnegie partnership. Because it was a partnership, they created their own rules. There was a rule that the minority partners, could only get their money out of the partnership at par value, meaning basically the value of the equipment, and that wasn't anywhere close to what the market value of Carnegie Steel was at that moment. So that actually went to court, and at one point ended with there's a book by this title too called "Meet You in Hell," and that's when Carnegie said, well, Mr. Frick, they always called each other Mr., said, well, we must get together and patch up our differences. And Frick said, I'll meet you in hell. So a lot of bad blood. And finally came the J.P. Morgan takeover of Carnegie Steel. There's some interesting detail about that and how the price was negotiated and what prompted it. But the final result was that J.P. Morgan in 1901 dollars paid $450 million for the Carnegie and Frick interests. If you translate that not just by inflation, but by what percent that was of GDP, it would make that $480 billion. And that would make it the largest financial transaction of all time. Carnegie himself got 250 million out of that. I've also translated that, and that would make him either the first or second richest man in the country today. And that, I guess, depends on what Tesla stock is doing today. So, these were big events and big occurrences that some of the country knew about, and I'm sure some of you knew about, but the conglomeration of all of them really created this incredible atmosphere in Pittsburgh. But, like I said, this is Jamie's story, and we see him grow up. We see him become a man and a professional reporter. You see all the tensions he has with his father and how that's worked out. You see him, one of his most difficult things is he was in this privileged position, and so he had access to some of these people who ran the railroads and the steel companies and the heads of the law firm. But he had to balance that access, I think today would call burning a source, by the need to tell the truth about what was going on. And he had successes and failures at this job. I think one of the most moving and difficult parts of the book for Jamie is how he uses an old troubled friend from New Haven as a source, and that ends badly. And then there's also Jamie has a somewhat complicated love life. You'll have to read about that in the book. One of the things I'm proudest of about the book is that I think I have very strong female characters. There's Eleanor, Jamie's mother, who is very bright, very well educated, is put into the kind of box of the role that women played in the 1880s and 90s. And that hurts her, diminishes her. She has substance abuse problems. She goes for what we would call cures today. But she rallies from that, and she gets pride in, first of all, working in Johnstown with the Red Cross. Clara Barton was there. And then she becomes a part of the suffrage movement and succeeds at that and becomes one of the national spokeswomen for the suffrage movement. Then there's Rita Hines, Jamie's off again girlfriend. Rita Hines is a fictional character with a factual name. In doing the research, I found out later on that there really was a Henrietta Hines, but that's not who my character is. In fact, my character, Rita Hines, is modeled a little bit after my mother. She's a great sportswoman, golf, which was just getting started then, tennis, shooting, fishing, things that women didn't do very much back in those days. And my mother was like that too. There's Jamie's aunt, Lila, who is Eleanor's sister. She's a bohemian. She wears caftans. Everybody today wears caftans, but as you can imagine, in 1890, they weren't wearing a lot of caftans. And she's great for giving Jamie advice about dealing with the rest of the family that she takes with more of a grain of salt than the seriousness with which they take themselves, and particularly with Rita. Now, the complicating part of dealing with Rita for Jamie, Rita doesn't let him off the hook about anything. If he's inattentive, she lets him know. But Jamie sort of takes a side route for a while with maybe my favorite character in the book, the mysterious Polish agitator, Zofia. Not going to tell you too much about that. Again, got to read it. Not going to give anything away. But besides these fictional characters, and one of the really fun parts is creating these fictional characters and bringing them to life, and then they sort of take on a life of their own. And that's a really fun part of doing this. But another fun thing about it was doing the research and finding out, digging a little deeper into the characters and the events and finding out some fascinating facts. One of the biggest revelations for me was that there was this area in Pittsburgh called Slabtown. And if you know the geography of Pittsburgh, you've got the two rivers, the Allegheny in the north and the Monongahela in the south, that come together to form the Ohio River. And that's called, that area in Pittsburgh is called the Point. And right across the Point now is the football stadium. I refuse to call it by its new name, but it's known as Heinz Field. And there's a road running, I think it's the General Thompson Road, that runs right behind it. And that's where an area called Slabtown was. And basically, that was the Irish-Scottish ghetto. That's where all the poorest people who were coming over from Ireland and Scotland came to live. And the people that came out of that area, Carnegie, that's where Carnegie was. It wasn't just Carnegie. It was Henry Phipps, who eventually went on to be the biggest real estate holder in Palm Beach, George Lauder, the Oliver brothers. Henry Oliver developed the Mesabi iron ore range. George Oliver was the newspaper publisher in Pittsburgh and later a senator. And the Pitcairns. There was Robert Pitcairn, who was the head of the Western Division of the railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad, and his brother John, who founded Pittsburgh Plate Glass. I mean, so these are 7, 8 people who, and they all lived in an area that I'm sure isn't any bigger than Stonington Borough, probably smaller. And how they all came out of that area was just incredible to me. Then there's what I found out about Carnegie. Obviously, he was incredibly talented, incredibly great businessman, but he had a real knack for self-deception and even hypocrisy. On the one hand, he would be giving speeches about the nobility of the working man, and then he'd be telling Henry Frick, break the unions however you can. I don't want to know the details. And then after Frick would do that, Carnegie would step back and say, well, that was Frick. I didn't have much to do with that. On the positive side, I don't think you can find anyone in the history of the country whose philanthropy has had the same kind of impact as Andrew Carnegie. We all know about the Carnegie libraries, which was an innovation at the time of having public libraries like this one. The museum complex in Pittsburgh, the Carnegie Hall in New York, the Carnegie Peace Fund, the Carnegie Heroes Fund, the International Peace Palace at The Hague. These are all Carnegie creations, and they're all still things that are vital today, vital philanthropies today. So he really did take that 250 million or 280 billion and put it to use, and it continues to be put to use. And I think Carnegie's name will be known a lot longer than Elon Musk's is. Then there's Henry Frick. We were fortunate enough to visit the Frick house named Clayton in Pittsburgh. You have, as a lot of homes did in that area, have bedrooms upstairs, one for the wife, one for the husband with the bathroom in between. When we walked through the bathroom to go into Henry Frick's bedroom, there were notches on the door frame. And I said, wow, he was notching the height of his kids back in that day. And that just showed me a much softer side than the stereotype of Henry Frick as a tough guy. There was also a room in the back with a large table in the middle, 2 tables on the side. Well, the 2 tables on the side was one for Henry and one for Adelaide, and the table in the middle was for the kids to play on. And that again, 1890s, children seen but not heard. that seemed to be different. Frick also, after these stressful confrontations, he would have what today we would call a nervous breakdown. Then they called it nervous exhaustion. And he had an ingenious solution to get over his nerve problems. He and Andrew Mellon would take a boat to Europe and buy art. Now, that's not something that we all have access to, but thank God they did, because that's the Frick Museum. That's the National Gallery in Washington from those gentlemen's trips to Europe. Then there was H.J. Heinz and George Westinghouse. They were very progressive for their era. They both had the beginnings of a retirement plans. They both had athletic facilities at their plants. They had a medical plan. They just did a lot more for their labor than Frick and Carnegie, who were shooting people to get them to work again and was making them work 12-hour days. Sometimes as they switched shifts, sometimes they'd have to work 24-hour days. And just from what I've read and I've seen at what a steel mill was like, it's a very dangerous place. And as any of us can attest, if you're working more than 12 hours, you're not paying much attention to what else is going on. So I just want to wrap up with talking a little bit about what I feel like I've accomplished with this book. I didn't want to write about the Gilded Age. I think people have heard enough about the Vanderbilts and the Astors and what was going on in New York City and who was trying to build the bigger house or the bigger opera house, or certainly up the road in Newport, what was going on up there. This was really, in New York City, it was kind of the second generation spending. Some of these men were still involved in their families' businesses, but a lot of them were just trying to spend the money as fast as they could. Pittsburgh was much different from that. They were building something. It's a hard scrabble town, and the executives would work, maybe not in as dangerous conditions, but they would work hard 7 days a week. They weren't concerned with the opulence. That would come later. After the Morgan buyout, the story is that there were 100 millionaires created overnight, when $1 million really meant something. And the sobriquet of the Pittsburgh people from Pittsburgh coming to New York, where they were dismissed as Pittsburgh millionaires. So what I wanted to do, and I hope I've accomplished this, is engage and entertain, basically tell a good story. I want to give a glimpse of the social, business, and political life in that area, and also showed some of the issues that are still persist to this day. I mean, immigration. Back then, it was Eastern Europeans. After the Bessemer process came to be used in the steel plants, you didn't need skilled workers. You just need non-skilled workers. And they would, Frick and the others would send agents into Eastern Europe to bring people, a lot of times who had been serfs before this, bring them to Pittsburgh and have them work in the mills. I mean, there's still a huge Eastern European population in Pittsburgh. Then there's, of course, income inequality. I've often heard when people talk about problems with income inequality today, they liken it back to this era. And I think I tried to do statistics at one point about the difference between what was being paid out to the executives and the maybe $10 a week that they were making in the mills. That's probably low. And what that would translate today, and it would be, I figured it's going to be about half of what the minimum wage is today. Then there was suffrage. What we, for then it was women's suffrage. Today it's voting rights all over the country, and whether voting rights are being stopped and dulled. And unionism. Frick and Carnegie killed the union in Pittsburgh. There's still a lot of battles over unions today and whether or not unions should even exist. Uh, and and finally, it wasn't an issue back then. The smoke and the fire and the dirt in Pittsburgh was celebrated. It meant people were working. Um, I remember my father, when he would go to work in Pittsburgh in the 50s and 60s, would take a second shirt to the office so he could change his shirt when he'd go out to lunch, after he'd go out to lunch. But there were no environmental concerns then, but you can see that how terrible the conditions were in Pittsburgh, why people finally started saying, you know, there's got to be a better way to do it, and people are getting sick from this, and we can do better. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking to everybody, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah.
Bill, you and I discussed the fact that we had a slightly radical view considering our education. You've just taken us. How would you compare the Titans, the Fricks, Westinghouse, Hineses, to the Jobs, Gates, Bezos, and the fellow you obviously dislike as much as I do, Elon Musk? How would you compare? Because it sounds like really a repetition. Some of our terribly wealthy guys have philanthropic trends, but not as deep, maybe.
Yeah.
What is the real difference? Have we get worse or better?
I think if the government would allow them, the guys today would be just as bad.
But would they be just as good in their philanthropic depth?
I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I think Bezos has shown some philanthropic tendencies.
Certainly Gates.
Yeah, Gates has too, where they've set up the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether it will rival, say, Carnegie and the Rockefeller family. Frick, I think his museum is wonderful. There's not a lot of Frick foundations out there, a lot of charity that the Frick family is doing. I mean, I think the world isn't as dangerous as it was, and industry isn't as dangerous as it was back then. But we don't know what's going on in China, where they're making the chips. And that's really, the money of some of these big companies is going into that. I think it's changed. I don't think people would be. I can't imagine somebody sending a trainload of hired private detectives in to break a strike today. But that was a different time, and people. The insistence back then was, this is my property, and I'll do what I want on my property. And don't tell me how I should feed my workers. Don't tell me how I should house them. Don't tell me how long they can work. And the whole notion of government involvement in regulating industry was unknown back then. So I think it's really hard to compare the two eras, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
So, Bill,
Yeah.
are we thinking of another book?
I've said to people that the two questions authors dislike the most are, have you finished the current book, and are you working on another book? I have finished the first one. I met with my publisher this winter. He would like me to write a sequel to this book. I had another idea that he didn't like very much, which is about a Southern man who's based on my great grandfather on that side, and he was a blockade runner and was in the Khedive's army of Egypt. And I was thinking about bringing him back and how he deals with Reconstruction and Jim Crow, but I think that sounded too controversial for my publisher. He wants me to write a sequel. The problem I'm having with that is finding the kind of tentpole events that guided me through Steel City. They don't exist in the 1900s and 1910s in Pittsburgh. I'm thinking, this is just thinking about Jamie and Rita moving to New York. He's done so well with his newspaper career, he could easily be hired by one of the New York papers, and what could happen there. So that's kind of where I am on that. Yeah, hi.
One of my favorite books is Larson, Devil in the White City.
Yep.
That he wrote about all the things that came out of that invention-wise.
Yep, and George Westinghouse was responsible for the unbelievable lights that they had.
So it's funny how different eras come up with different sections, inventions, and
Yeah.
insights.
Yeah. You know, an interesting thing about that is there's an organization in New York, or what's all over the world actually, called PEN. And PEN collects money and defends writers all over the world. Many have been put in jail by authoritarian regimes. And they have dinners around New York where you have, you know, only about 20 people and an author. And we went to one with Eric Larson, and it was about his Lusitania book. Yeah, but he wanted to talk about Devil in the White City because Leonardo DiCaprio had optioned it, and it's still, and that was a long time. That was 5 or 6 years ago, and I still haven't seen the Devil in the White City movie, but it would be a wonderful movie. Really exciting. I think my book would be a pretty good movie too. I think it might be a good miniseries, but I guess the writers' strike, they can't do it right now. So
Oh, you just wait.
yeah, yeah, sure.
I'm not sure what the connection is. Someone here might know, but I think that the Ferguson brothers, who took Fisher's Island private after it had been a destination and a kind of beach island, did that after the merger. They were bankers in the Bessemer acquisition. They were related to that somehow and made their money in that transaction.
Yeah, the Bessemer Trust Company,
There's still a private bank called that.
the private bank called Bessemer, and that was founded by the Phipps family. Henry Phipps, who was he was actually the second largest shareholder in the partnership, in the Carnegie Steel Partnership, and he was Carnegie's money man. Yeah.
They were on the Morgan side.
Oh, they were on the Morgan side. Okay.
The other thing I would say is, I grew up in Pittsburgh. My father was a partner at Reed Smith, and he was a labor lawyer through the 60s and 70s and 80s. And in terms of the transitions, what you were talking about driving out here from there, we came here to see my grandparents. I live over on Cove Road in their house. We knew that we were back in Pittsburgh because at night, as you came in on the Parkway, you'd see this enormous gouts of flame that were 50 and 100 feet high that lit the night as you came around the skirts.
That's,
You maybe didn't because you got off at Swissville, maybe.
no, I knew that well because that was the J&L works.
Yeah, that was the J&L.
The Jones and Laughlin works. And actually, that leads me into a good story about the cover of my book. I love this cover. And it was originally a darker picture. And my publisher saw it and said, no, I don't like that. And then my editor got in touch with me and said, gave me a shot of this. And I said, I love it. And he said, well, you get it for free too. Well, it turns out that my publisher owns this painting. It's by, it's Gorse, exactly. It's a Gorson painting, and it's of the J&L Works, the Eliza furnace at the J&L Works.
That's what you saw when you came in.
Yeah, that's exactly.
The kid asleep in the car looking out the window. It was hell itself. I know it was astonishing.
Yeah. And another interesting thing, I mentioned the Cary furnace that we visited. This was the Eliza furnace. There was the Lucy furnace. You might be seeing a trend here. All these furnaces were named after the steel executives' wives. Lucy was Thomas Carnegie's wife. Cary was Phipps's wife. And Eliza was B.F. Jones's wife of Jones and Laughlin. But it's a terrific painting. And I've since looked, there are Gorsons, a lot of Gorsons around Pittsburgh. There's one at the Duquesne Club. There are a couple at the Pittsburgh Golf Club. He's a great painter. Unfortunately, people have gotten to notice them. I've tried to buy a couple, didn't quite work out. So, thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed it. Hope you did too. And if you haven't bought a book already, Bank Square Books is in the back, and we'll be happy to sell you one, and I'll be happy to sign it.
Oh, that was great. That
Well,
was
thank
great.
you.
You're a good